And I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the National Disability Insurance Scheme Bill 2012, and I commend the member for Herbert for his, particularly for his passion in his speech. Whilst I didn't hear all of his speech, but I do want to point out two things to him. One, I think, is it might have been a slip of the tongue where he said that the states are the largest providers for people with disabilities. Obviously, as a local member, he would recognise that it's actually the NGOs who provide the services. The states merely pass on the money, primarily. So and I'm sure some of the NGOs he mentioned are actually looking after the people with disabilities. So that's why this, as he said, is a great opportunity, because it is the local, as in the local NGOs, and the states and the federal government have the ability to work together. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. The second thing I would ask of him, as he rightly pointed out, good government is about making sure you have the right priorities. And I would ask him to ask the Premier of Queensland, Campbell Newman, to make this much more of a priority, and perhaps to revisit the state member who signed the pledge, the NDIS pledge, to go back and say, perhaps it might be a time to look at some of the priorities. Rather than building a new tower of office for politicians down in the middle of Brisbane, perhaps we could look at the NDIS scheme, which would benefit all of Queensland. I would ask him that, because obviously Queensland is the odd state out in that it does not have a trial site. And that's something that's an opportunity missed, I would suggest, because, and I don't like to praise our Victorians, I don't think there are any in the chamber, apart from the Deputy Speaker. The reality is Victoria gets it much better. They spend $10 on someone with a disability compared to a Queenslander's $7. And that's under Labor, Liberal, National Party government. So I'm not making a political point, it's an empirical fact that Queensland needs to lift its game more than any other state, especially when compared to Victoria, that does it so much better. So in 2011, the Productivity Commission reported in the disability supports available in Australia for the federal government, as touched on by previous speaker. And that report revealed the needs of people across Australia with disability, their families, that their needs and their families and carers' needs were unmet. The Gillard Labor Government knew immediately that widespread action had to be taken to remedy this distressing situation. So on the 3rd of December 2012, I, like many other politicians around Australia, had the pleasure of going out to their local community workers to talk about the International Day of People with Disability, because the NDIS was a topic on everybody's lips. And luckily for me, I went out to the Endeavour Foundation to look at some of the great work that they do. Endeavour is one of Australia's largest non-government disability service providers, supporting more than 3,350 people with a disability across 230 locations in Australia, and just one of the many disability service organisations I'm proud to have in my electorate. And I will mention some of the others later. Endeavour Foundation is a great supporter of giving people with disability a right to have control over the decisions that affect their lives. It might have started with a different brief, as so many of these charities did, which was much more of a nanny state sort of brief, but now it's much more of a partnership with people with disabilities and their carers. They support funding for those who provide assistance to people with disability, their families and their carers. And it was a great opportunity for me to tour the factory that the Endeavour Foundation members work in, and looking at the individual jobs that people did and the pride that they had in some of the jobs was an assembly line process, basically. Some people with severe intellectual disabilities were still able to contribute to the production line. Others with disabilities that didn't hamper them as much were supervising. It was a great process. Great to see the dignity and the joy that came with people working together in a team, contributing, making money. Obviously they were being paid at different rates depending on what they contributed, but it was great to see the dignity that pervaded the room, and I thank the Endeavour Foundation for the great work they do. because that model is basically what the National Disability Insurance Scheme is about. It's about making sure that people have dignity and control and work and have their lives, as much control as possible in their lives, to make sure that they have control over the decisions that affect their life. Just last week, I went down the road from my home to meet with Deaf Services Queensland in Moorooka to discuss the future opportunities and some of the challenges that their members face. Like many other disability service organisations, sadly they are struggling to fund their services, and they've taken a few hits in terms of cuts from the state government, these important services that they provide, that Deaf Services Queensland provide, and the skills that they've acquired over the years, some of them might hopefully, they might get lost or left behind. My electorate of Moreton is home to many peak disability bodies, including Multicap, which I'm proud to say is actually doing some work in the NDIS pilot project in their 8 Mile Plains, and Westside Community Services and the Kyabra Community Care Association, to name just a few. The Moreton electorate is also serviced by other great organisations that include Montrose Access, Contact Incorporated, Huntington's Queensland, Spinal Injuries Association, and many, many others, all groups that passionately advocate for the people they represent with disabilities. The Gillard Labor Government is determined to provide support for those who need it most, and is working hard in some tough discussions, admittedly, with the state and territory governments to achieve the level of care that Australians need. In my home state of Queensland, members of my community and those of my colleagues are struggling to make ends meet under the current disability support legislation and arrangements. As I said, compared to Victoria, where it is $7 for every person with a disability in Queensland, to the $10 that someone in Victoria receives. Sadly, at the moment, Premier Newman is leaving fellow Australians behind, and by falling short by $300 million of funding for the NDIS that would have been available. Raising awareness about the rights of people with disabilities has grown significantly since the United Nations introduced the Declaration of the Rights of Disabled Persons in 1974. How much things have changed since then. So I'm proud to be part of the government that in 2008 sanctioned, with 111 other countries, the convention recognising the equal rights of all people with disabilities to live in the community, to have access to a range of in-home, residential and other community support services necessary to support living and, importantly, inclusion in the community, and to prevent isolation or segregation from the community. I'm proud to be standing on this side of the House that will recognise these opportunities for people with disability by supporting and delivering the NDIS, which will slowly become a reality for thousands of Australians. The major reforms in the NDIS will give people with disability more control and choice over their care and support, irrespective of where they live in Australia, which at the moment is a bit of a lottery, or the other lottery associated with how they acquired their disability. This reform, this important legislative reform, is about developing innovative services that are delivered on a local level, and I know the local disability service organisations are looking forward to the process and would be proud to implement this historic legislation. I particularly, I'm going to finish with mentioning, by touching on the word dignity, and I want to mention a gentleman that comes from my hometown by the name of Kevin Cox. And I see there's an article in Mamamia today saying we need to talk about Kevin. I'm going to mention 2 Kevins who I was lucky enough to go to dinner with at the Convention Centre in Queensland a few years back. It was when Prime Minister Rudd was kind enough to take myself up to the ACTU dinner one night. Although you can tell the ACTU is a Victorian organisation because they organised the dinner to be on the night of a State of Origin event. Only Victorians would do that in Queensland, but we were proud to have the dinner there, so I flew up on the government jet with Prime Minister Rudd and went to the Convention Centre, came in from the airport in the government car, went in, sat down, and I sat down at my table and turned around, and right behind me was a gentleman by the name of Kevin Cox, who is in a wheelchair. He's in a wheelchair because he had a rugby league accident, which I remember seeing in my hometown of St George. And Kevin, at the time, I mean, he had been a shearer, and I think he was working in the banking industry when the accident occurred. I remember where I was standing, I think it was 1979 or 78, no, 79 I think it was, where seeing the accident, he ended up in a wheelchair, as a simple sort of country bloke from St George, and then was in a wheelchair and became more and more active in disability rights. And in fact, when Wayne Goss was Premier and Kevin Rudd was one of his major advisors, the government decided to build a convention centre. And so they built this fantastic convention centre, which I'd commend to anyone, but the only thing is they did not put access for people with disabilities. And they sort of said, well, we've got all these fantastic steps, you can just go around the back and go up, up in the service entrance, basically. And Kevin Cox, this sort of country bloke from St George, said, that's not right. He said, that's not, in whatever year it was, in the late 1980s, he said, that's not right, we should do something more. We don't need to go in through the kitchen entrance. We're the same as everybody else. Took on the government and won. Well, and so there I was at that dinner with my Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and right next to me was Kevin Cox. So these two Kevins, here was me, this bloke from St George, and there was Kevin Cox. As this other bloke from St George ended up there, and we were talking to each other saying, how did this happen? How did we end up here at the convention centre? The very convention centre that he made sure put their steps in, this tale of sort of two Kevins, I guess. And I'm proud to say that now that bloke, Kevin Cox, the shearer, bank worker from St George, is now the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in Queensland, standing up for all Queenslanders with disabilities. And I just think of the NDIS, what the NDIS will do to make sure that every Kevin Cox has an opportunity to take control of their life, because not everyone will have the courage of Kevin Cox to stand up to a state government, a Labor government, and say that's not right. But the NDIS will hopefully set up a schema that will promote such opportunities, and I commend the legislation to the House.